Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the RavenCast. My name is Adam Erickson, and I'm excited today because we have my friend Matt Distefano here today. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Awesome. I'm doing great, but your image is so blurry, I can hardly see you.
Yeah, I want to apologize that I don't know if it's my webcam or if it's my internet or both.
Well, I kind of like it because it makes you mysterious, and it also makes
Very
you look really
mysterious.
fast. Give me one.
And
Give
if
me
I
one of
move
these.
really fast, then I have superpowers.
Yes, you are the Flash. I love
No
it.
apologies.
It's all good. It's all good. Well, I'm excited to talk with you today because you have we did a interview about your first book, which is
Hey.
All Set Free. I've got it right here. Fantastic stuff. Highly recommend it. But today we're going to talk about From the Blood of Abel, your most recent book. The little altar right there, right there. Yeah, right
Right
there.
there. There it
And
is.
for people who can watch on YouTube. And From the Blood of Abel, Humanity's Root Causes of Violence and the Bible's Theological Anthropological Solution. It's quite a title. I love it. But before we get into our discussion, I just want to tell everybody that the RavenCast is a product of the Raven Review, an online magazine where we write about mimetic theory and rivalry and violence and scapegoating that often divides our communities and our world. And our motto at the Raven Review is change your view, change the world. So if you'd like to hear new perspectives on religion, politics, pop culture, current events, perspectives that bridges divides and seeks to bring people together, come check us out at the Raven Review at ravenfoundation.org. And it's awesome because Matt writes for the Raven Review. He writes for his website, which is the book name, All Set Free. So check out Matt's book and Matt's website. And hey, while you're at it, if you're not friends with Matt on Facebook, go do that because everything that Matt writes is absolutely worth reading and edifying. And so go check him out. So, Matt, thank you so much for being here with us today.
And thanks for that nice introduction. Appreciate it.
Well, you are welcome, my friend. So we're going to talk about From the Blood of Abel, and we're also going to talk today about an upcoming book that you have with Michael Machuga. Did I
Yep.
pronounce Michael's name right?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, good. Awesome. Michael Machuga, called A Journey with Two Mystics. I've read both of these books. They're great. So thank you for writing them and for co-writing them and for being here today. So first, let's get into From the Blood of Abel. It is an ambitious title, especially the subtitle, which is Humanity's Root Causes of Violence and the Bible's Theological Anthropological Solution. It starts, so the title is From the Blood of Abel. So the Cain and Abel story is important to you. Why is that? Why did you have that as the title of your book?
Well, the title comes from Luke 11 when Jesus refers to he attaches his death to that of Abel and Zechariah. And as Girardians, those of us who study Girard probably understand that culture's myth, there's a murder myth that is at the beginning of different cultures, Rome, Greek, and then the Hebrew story as well with Cain and Abel. And so when we look back at our foundings, we notice that it starts with a murder. And so all culture would be founded on blood. And so that's what I'm trying to elicit in the title there.
I love it. And there's a difference between the way that the Genesis account talks about this murder at the beginning and the way that, say, the Roman myths talk about it, right?
There is, and in the Roman version, Romulus slays Remus over a dispute over an omen on where to found the city. and then he's sort of immortalized as the founder of Rome. And the Hebrew story puts a twist on it. After Cain kills Abel, God puts a mark on Cain, and in an attempt to stop violence dead in its tracks there, which, if we read in the story, it's only a few generations where violence gets out of hand. Lamech is, killing a kid and then boasting to his wives that he takes vengeance 77-fold. And then when we get to the flood, it's violence and corruptions filled the entire earth. And so in the Hebrew version, I think it's an attempt to stop violence and also introduce the voice of the victim. Abel cries for vengeance from the grave, and that's something unique to other ancient mythologies.
Yeah, even though it is crying for vengeance, as the New Testament epistle Hebrews tells us, right? God even hears that voice.
Sure.
There's something important in there about God listening to the voice of the victim, to even the victim who cries out for vengeance. It's something that, like, you hear throughout the Psalms, and something that a lot of people bristle at. This call for vengeance, but there's something important about God even listening to that voice.
Sure, and it's it's why I appreciate the Bible so much, is that it includes that, but then we progress towards something down, when we get to Jesus. But even throughout the Old Testament, we hear different voices. We get to Joseph in the end of Genesis, who is a forgiving victim.
Mm-hmm.
He forgives his brothers for what they did.
You write that one of the root causes of violence is the anxiety of death. And you give significant attention to Ernest Becker, who spent his life on the topic. And I do often hear Girardians referring to Ernest Becker, but nothing as heavily influenced as your book. Can you tell us about Ernest Becker and why you think he's important for understanding violence in the world?
Yeah, Becker was a cultural anthropologist who wrote a book, The Denial of Death, and it actually won a Pulitzer Prize. And actually, Richard Beck, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He also talks a lot about Becker's work, and so I learned a lot from Dr. Beck. Yeah, Becker argues that it's our anxiety over our death that eventually leads to violence. We create these, what he calls, immortality systems, to protect either literally or symbolically our idea of ourself, so we can convince ourselves that we go on after our death. The problem is that different religions have different quote unquote immortality systems, and we found that it's vitally important to protect these immortality systems, even using violence to do so. And in the book, I list examples, but we can think of thousands of examples. Whether it's the Protestants and the Catholics, different sects within Islam, Jews and Muslims, Christians and Muslims, and vice versa.
Yeah, it's interesting. James Allison also does a lot with the fear of death. He says that Jesus comes and saves us from the fear of death. He takes the place of death, even, so that we don't have to fear it anymore. I'm wondering, are they on the same page here with the fear of death and the anxiety of death? Have you thought about that much?
Yeah, I think so. It's Hebrews 2:14-15 that talks about that it's our fear of death that's the problem of that then leads to sin. That's the real problem, and I think it's the Eastern Orthodox who take that view rather than sin leading to death. It's the fear of death that leads to sin, and I don't pay too much attention on what's the correct way. I just right. I do make a mention that Protestants take the sin to death, and the Eastern Orthodox that fear of death leads to sin. But I just say it's for our purposes now. I mean, it's kind of a chicken and the egg thing, but yeah, I think James Allison would be spot on with that.
Yeah, yeah. Did Ernest Becker come from a religious point of view, or did he have a spiritual tradition? Do you know?
I'm not really sure. I know he includes the resurrection story as another one of the immortality systems, which it sort of looks like it. And just like when thinking of the gospel and is gospel myth, well, it looks like it on the surface. And that's what you point out in the book, in your essay in the book. But that doesn't mean there's not something else going on there.
I want to say to our listeners, feel free to write a comment or a question in the chat room if you have anything you'd like to ask. So the second root cause that you talk about is mimetic desire. A lot of our viewers will probably be familiar with it, but what is it about mimetic desire that has been helpful for you in understanding violence?
Well, for me, being a dad, I don't talk about this too much in the book, but it completely changes the way you parent. It definitely keeps you on your game and noticing how, children are much more unfiltered than adults tend to be. So you can really see their mimetic responses pretty openly. So once you notice that your kids imitate you non-consciously, their behavior is, it's their behavior, but it's also a reflection of you too, as well as your spouse and their friends at school and yada yada yada. But as a parent, you're obviously primary in that. So it's really helped me be nonviolent in parenting. Finding alternate solutions rather than, like, let's say, taking her things and saying, well, you'll just get it back later. That can have a place in a certain context, but just trying to think more creatively in approaching those things. In terms of my own violence, gossip's a big one. It's really easy I find myself wanting to scapegoat people really easily, and especially people who I justify. And that's how it goes, right? We're always going to justify those sort of things, and it really helped me catch myself and how easy it is to gossip and scapegoat, and then maybe realize it after we've done it. But now it's easier to realize it as we're doing it, so where we can make a choice to put a stop to it.
Yeah, you're reminding me of Rene Girard's claim that it's always easy to see when other people are scapegoating, but much more difficult to see when we are doing it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. It's one of the traps that I'm seeing, especially during the politics these days. It's just all about finding who the one is to blame. And I don't know, like, how do we get out of this trap? Because this is, if we take the Genesis story, the Adam and Eve story, this is where it all begins, right? With the scapegoating, the accusation that Adam accuses Eve and even accuses God for making Eve. And this is like the break within humans amongst ourselves, and the break with our relationship with God. And it seems like we can't get out of it. Do you have any thoughts on how to get out of this? We're so stuck in it, and I'm getting notifications from like every website that I've ever looked on telling me about this how horrible things are in the world today. And I think it's part of the problem. Like, it's hard to get out of this trap of accusations against one another.
It's so hard. Two things initially come to mind. Like the verse, pick up your cross daily. It's a daily struggle, and none of this is going to be easy. But I think the importance of talking about positive mimesis and positive imitation, that there's something to following Jesus and this ethic, and Um, Approaching Jesus for me as the true human and someone that I can really actually follow and it's worth following. Um, I don't want that to be like some cop out pseudo theological claim, but I mean, it's easier said than done, but man,
No,
yeah,
I
I mean,
like I
coming
like
together and doing it together. I mean, on our own, it's impossible. It seems.
Yeah, no, I like it because um, it we're just so I feel like so many of us are just stuck in the protest, in the no, saying no to something that we forget the positive aspect that you're pointing to. What is worth saying yes to? What is the alternative way of being in the world? And following Jesus is it. As our as Gerard would say, as our model.
Mhm.
There is the other thing that I'm struggling with is the tension between, um, you know, justice, I guess. The tension between, working in the world for a better way and also seeking justice, because so oftentimes justice gets confused with revenge, which just gets us back in the accusation cycle. Um, so I don't know, like, do you have any thoughts on justice and what we can do to make the world a more just place without getting caught in the accusation method?
I think with justice, it's important to start with a like a working definition of a term that we agree on, because if justice is retributive or vengeful as opposed to restorative,
Mm.
we're gonna end up with different end games. There's going to be a different telos. I mean, if we're working to rehabilitate victim and victimizer if possible, then that's different than if we're working with the eye for an eye model. Um, so I think it's important to start with what is justice. I mean, is it just trying to prevent crime, let's say, by punishing people harsh enough that it deters it, or are we trying a different model like they're doing in Holland, where their prisons are going empty because they have a more restorative justice model and people just aren't coming back, even though their prisons are like these kind of nice looking country clubs, we would call them, compared to our prisons.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
I think our prison system has shown that this model of justice doesn't work. It works to make money, I guess.
Well, that's where my thought went to, the prison industrial complex, to
Sure.
just make money and stuff, but it's not working, as you say.
Yeah, I think it's starting with the wrong model.
Yeah.
I mean, we're really not that. We don't seem that intent on restoring victimizers and bringing. I mean, having forgiveness and reconciliation. I mean, that just doesn't seem to be on our radar so much. It's more about how do we have harsh enough sentences to where people are deterred from committing crimes, and in a way that seems noble, I guess, but it just doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a great sermon that our friend Tom Truby, who's on
Mm-hmm.
with us today, wrote recently, 2 weeks ago, I think. And it's about this African American man who has intentionally gone to befriend members of the KKK. And this is on PBS. There's a documentary about it. And he goes out and he befriends them, even like really high up members of the KKK. I don't remember, like Grand Dragon something. And he goes and he befriends them. And after they build this relationship, this even friendship, they end up giving him their robes. And so he has this big collection of their robes, and they've given up this life because of this friendship with him. So he doesn't go out. This, I think, is exactly what you're pointing to in restorative justice, where you're restoring relationships through this positive model, as opposed to saying, oh, you're just evil and I hate you. It's about transformation, transforming relationships.
Yeah, that dude understands Jesus more than I do. That takes unbelievable courage and faith.
Yeah, yeah, it's an amazing thing. So let's get back to the Bible because you make this claim in the subtitle of your book that the Bible has this solution, this theological, anthropological, this divine, and this human solution to violence, which is a really interesting claim because when I talk this way on Facebook, a lot of people end up pushing back saying that the Bible is an incredibly violent book, right? So how can you make the claim that the Bible holds this great solution to our violence when, as we were talking about before, there's this great God causes this great big flood and not only kills everyone, but like the geocide, like he's like killing the whole like Earth.
Yeah, the whole lot of them. Except,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's ironic because it's I mean, the violence in the Bible is the reason I became an atheist at one point because I was told that the God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And then there's some philosophical, theological gymnastics that go on to kind of justify some of the really, especially harsh Old Testament texts and things like that. But then really understanding that the beauty of the Bible is that it includes that and doesn't shy away from it, and then critiques it as it goes, and almost creates this, like, we could say God inspired set of scriptures. And I don't mean the Protestant Bible is the only inspired text. I just mean like Michael Hardin would say there's a hermeneutic that's inspired, and with Christ being the like the culmination of this story, we can see how Gerard would say it's a text in travail, and it progresses towards something, but not in the neat line. It just ebbs and flows, as he would say.
Text in travail. When I use this term, a lot of people are like, what do you mean text in travail? Can you explain what that term means?
Well, I just to me it means that it includes all these different voices. It includes the voice of religion, the sacrifice demanding God, zeal for that type of God's violence in that God. But it also includes, like we mentioned, the voice of the victim who cries for vengeance. And then when we get to the suffering servant doesn't necessarily have a voice. And then we get to Jesus, and Jesus, the voice of the forgiving victim. And James Allison introduced the term the intelligence of the victim. So it has all these different voices that are included, and it's like our task to, quote, rightly divide the word. I mean, we don't just pick these verses out. We don't just have this hermeneutic of, if it says God did it. We have to step back and see this through Jesus and through the cross.
Well, that's what I was gonna ask you, because a lot of people say you're just cherry picking, right? So you're just cherry picking, the good, nice parts that you like, and what about all the bad parts? So how do you? And I know that you've dealt with this question before, but I think it's really important because that's an accusation that often gets brought up with us Girardians. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I owe a lot of stuff that I've learned to Michael Hardin, pointing out that Jesus and Paul had a way of interpreting things, and so it's not quite cherry picking. It's not just picking like what I want to pick that fits my worldview or what I want to do. It's picking in the same manner that they did. And if we're really gonna say like Jesus is our God or our image of God or however, whatever our Christology is, like it would behoove us to approach the scriptures in the way he did. And so yes, the accusation is sort of true that you're cherry picking, but I mean we all kind of cherry pick anyway. But yeah, there's a certain way to cherry pick, I would say, and I've kind of taken that accusation just to say, oh, okay, yeah, sure, I do that, I guess.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
What's an example of how Jesus cherry picked?
Um, Luke 4:18 and 19, he quotes Isaiah 61, 1 through 2, and drops, this is the Jubilee text, and drops the last little clause, and the day of vengeance of our God. Um, he does the same sort of things in Luke 7 when John the Baptist sends disciples to him to ask Jesus if he's the one, and he quotes all these Isaianic and from First and Second Kings as well, and quotes bits and pieces of them, and then leaves off some of the vengeful texts around it. Paul does similar things too, and I put a lot of the examples, or some of the examples that I wanted to use in the book there.
Yeah. Do you suppose that that's what makes a lot of his contemporaries angry with him, that he's trying to separate vengeance from God?
It seems to be. I mean, especially in the Luke 4 one, that the way that passage reads to me is that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, because right after that, they want to throw him off a cliff, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't make sense that Jesus would just be sarcastic for no reason, and it doesn't make. I mean, why were they so hot to begin with? That I think there was something going on there, and if the day of Jubilee didn't include like violent deliverance from the oppressors, like what kind of day is this? Like how are we going to be delivered from the hands of the Romans if you drop the vengeance of God?
Yeah, and there's a part of me that's really sympathetic towards that. Like, there's a big part of me that's really sympathetic towards that.
Yeah.
Right. Like I mean, it's like you put yourself there in the first century, and you've got this great massive empire controlling your life, taking away all of your money, taxing you literally to death, and you want something to happen, and it's hard to get out of your imagination that the only way that this can happen is through violence, and it's not going to be our violence. So we've got to rely on God's violence to get rid of these oppressors.
Absolutely. And if I'm honest, that's just the way I operate. A vengeful God makes total sense, because when something, if I stub my toe on my bed corner, or something bad happens at work, let's say, what do we want to do? We want to come kick the dog, or we want to punch a hole in the wall, or it's such a natural response for so many of us, this tit for tat escalating sort of thing,
Yeah. So so this is the Bible's solution. This is Jesus's solution to all this. What is the solution to all of this violence that's happening?
Oh man. The solution is, I think, there's a path. There's a Jesus path. There's a forgiving your enemies path, and it's a narrow gate. It's a narrow way, not a broad way. It's a super difficult one that I'm not always too optimistic about. It's hard to be optimistic. Yeah, statistically we might be less violent now, but it seems like our it's something's coming to a pressure cooker that doesn't have a release valve. Seems like it's teetering on the edge of explosion. So it's hard to be optimistic, but I think there is a way, a path, and I would call it a Jesus path. But I would also, I co-wrote this next book with my friend who leans more as a Buddhist, and a lot of the same things he understands them in the same way. I mean, he's a Christian as well, but it seems like this path transcends faith traditions. I just think like having that interfaith dialogue would be important, because I think if people could understand that better, rather than thinking like completely dualistically, like if you're a Christian, you're not a Buddhist. Well, I mean, you can practice Buddhism and be a Christian, let's say. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to have that interfaith dialogue.
Yeah, I like that. So in this book, from the blood of Abel and also in All Set Free, you talk a lot about salvation. And this is kind of where we're going with the answer, with this question of what's the solution, I think. What for you, why is salvation such an important part of your work?
Again, like try to talk about salvation without making sure we're understanding like the term, because what I used to think about salvation was like being saved from hell.
Mm.
And it came down to like a salvific phrase that you might say, or if you're like me, ask Jesus into your heart at least 10 times.
Mm.
But now, I mean, I see it now as a healing thing, a freeing of one's will, which is to do the will of the Father and to be non-rivalrous, and to like denounce scapegoating, and also to have our fear of death completely undone. I mean, if we have faith in the resurrection, that's completely salvific, because our fear of death, I think, just drives us non-consciously to some really bad places.
Yeah, a lot of what we are guided towards in these things, in these acts, is kind of an end game. And I did an interview with Eric Bies recently, and he was like, Jesus loves without regard to what's going to happen to him, without regard to whatever the end game is. So he's going to love, and it may cost him his life. So things like efficiency or success, as the world defines success and whatnot. I mean, this was, as you mentioned earlier, led to the cross, which is the most unsuccessful thing that could happen to a religious leader, right? Death. And so he loves without regard for the end game, for what's going to happen. Of course, there's the resurrection, but
Sure.
But I think that's a key element to it.
And isn't that where true freedom is found? Because no matter what, like no one could change that fact that he was going to love and forgive even while being murdered. And he was not, he was free to do so. That was on his own free will. And that's, I think, when we talk about like freedom, that's where not even while you're being murdered can someone change your view, can change your love for them.
Yeah. That's a powerful thing.
That's great.
Yeah, I like it. So you mentioned your upcoming book with Michael Machuga, A Journey with Two Mystics, Conversations Between a Gerardian and a Wattsian. It's a fascinating correspondence between the two of you, and you both call yourselves mystics, and I'm wondering what the term mystic means to you.
Well, it's kind of a loaded term. I mean, people kind of fling it around.
Right.
For both Michael and I, it has a lot to do with self-reflection, contemplation, meditating, and emptying oneself to listen, quote unquote, to God. I put the listen in air quotes. I think the term kenosis, like emptying oneself for the other. I mean, this might not be how others define mystics, but seeing as that's how I see our God, who Jesus reflects, that's how I would see that union with the divine. Both Michael and I love being out in the wilderness. We love hiking together, and I think being meditative and contemplative out there, and again listening to the divine speak throughout all of creation. I think that's where all those things go into that term for us.
You put listening to God in air quotes. What do you mean by that? Like there's something more than hearing God's literal voice speaking to you. So
I hope so, because he's never spoke to me if that's the case.
Yeah, right.
I think shutting off the logical mind, the ego that always is chattering and trying to conceptualize everything and put things into categories: up, down, left, right, tall, short, black, white. Giving, that's an important part to how we humans think. However, it's also like the loud part that most of us can't ever shut up. So putting that aside and being more intuitive, listen, like just that chatterbox. That's always. I think that's a key to quote unquote listening to God, and also with the Spirit is also always going to be forgiving, always going to be for the spirit of shalom. A lot of people say, well, the Spirit told me this, or the Spirit told me that. God told me this, God told me that. And you're like, I don't think God would tell you that, but how do we test that? So I think we test it with those things. Like I try to talk about in the book, like the spirit of forgiveness, the spirit of shalom.
It reminds me of we just celebrated the first Sunday of Lent, and Tom Truby did another great sermon on this, where the story was Genesis 2 and 3, and we've talked a little bit about this, but going to when they eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, this is another way in which we divide the world up, these dualistic worldview of good and evil. And, moderns often wonder, well, what's so bad with the knowledge of good and evil? And atheists are like, well, this is where religion tries to keep us ignorant and stupid of good and evil. But there's something more to this. I mean, once we get consumed with the knowledge of good and evil, we forget about the knowledge of God, which is, as you say, this forgiveness.
Sure. Yeah, if we get into the knowledge of good and evil, we're going to get into the judge, juries, and executioners on what is good and evil, and those who we say are evil and not good. And right. and other groups are going to say, well, no, this is what's good and this is what is evil. And we just, when we view something as evil, we certainly have a tendency to go in guns blazing and ask questions later,
Right. And as you say in From the Blood of Abel, you make the point that we always see ourselves as good and the other as evil, and they always see us as evil and them as good. It's just it's the problem with the knowledge of good and evil, I guess. So
it certainly seems to be.
Yeah. So you claim you are the Girardian and Michael is the Wattsian, and a lot of our listeners are familiar with Girard's work. We've talked about it a little bit here. What does Alan Watts have to offer to this conversation, to the book?
Mike likes him because he's a very non-esoteric thinker. Things are pretty straightforward and a lot of profound wisdom in a short amount of space. I quote Watts because some of his quotes are very Girardian. He talks about society being an extension of the self and vice versa, and that we don't, we're never disconnected from our society. We see through that lens. I think Watts does a good job of understanding both Christianity and Buddhism and being able to talk about both in an understandable way. Mike would be the more read on Watts. I think I've only read one of his books. Mm-hmm. But Watts has a lot of good things to say about our interconnectedness and the interconnectedness with God and creation.
You're the Christian and Mike is the Buddhist Christian. And you've talked a little bit about the importance of interreligious dialogue. What did you learn about Buddhism while writing this book?
It's really helped me understand thinking non-conceptually. I think it's the term is apophatic, like maybe we talk about things and what they're not rather than placing direct labels on them. Mm-hmm. It's helped me understand what's called the law of least effort. So if you're looking at something and you squint your eyes, you're only distorting your vision. You're not actually, you're trying harder, but it's self-defeating.
Mm.
So there's this like, in the West, we have this way of like, try harder, do bigger, badder, ever. And the Buddhists would be like, well, no, try less and don't conceptualize things and just dance the dance. And it's like almost complete. And I mean, we hear these things, but really, really thinking and meditating on them, they do tend to make intuitive sense. Like it's like the ego wants to conceptualize everything and justify every behavior you do, or whereas like the enlightened Buddhists may just allow things to be as they are, and just what Watts would say, the point of dancing is dancing.
Mm.
There's not like you don't get to the last move in the dance and be like, oh, I understand the point now. The point was the dance.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I love it. The point is the dance, and obviously, like this resonates with Christian theology and the Trinity, where the early Christians said the Trinity is not primarily about God or the Father exerting God's wrath upon the Son, but the Trinity is about this eternal dance in the world, this giving and receiving of mutual love between these three persons. And the term they used is perichoresis, which comes from choreography, and God. It means God is dancing, is how the early Christians talked about the Trinity.
Yeah, and that's, like Mike says in the book, that's a Christianity that we can get on board with, the wrath stuff. I mean, we can talk about God's wrath in a nuanced way if we want to use that term, but as far as like, there's God pouring wrath on a son, like, I'm sorry, like I'm a dad, like it just doesn't there's no resonance there.
Right.
It may end up being true, like for all we know. I mean, it's possible, I guess, but I just don't see any analogy that father-son relationship doesn't work in my like experiences as a father.
Yeah, and people will often say, well, don't project your experience of a father onto God, but Jesus does this. I mean, he says, which one of you who are fathers would give a scorpion to your children?
Sure.
Right. So he uses human relationships all the time, and of course you wouldn't give a scorpion to your children.
No. And that's the analogy the Bible gives us. So it's like, how can I am a father, like, don't project it. Well, I'm not. I'm just like, I better not be a better father than God because I fail a lot. So,
right.
you know what I mean?
I like that. So one of your chapters in this upcoming book is called "Jesus is Lord," period, which is an interesting way to title a chapter of a book when you're in interreligious dialogue with someone. So what do you mean by Jesus is Lord, period?
Well, growing up, I was, we were more than recommended that we needed to make Jesus Lord of our life. And when you do a little bit of research, you realize like lordship in the first few centuries, that's not what they were talking about. Like Caesar was Lord. And so when this group of, Jesus followers follow this recently executed, um, Jewish guy, it has a political context there, and Jesus was Lord over everything. And so, and then I talk about when Paul uses the phrase that all will declare Jesus as Lord. I'm trying to make a point that, I mean, when I had the belief in hell, like it was interpreted to me that when some declare Jesus as Lord, then it's going to be like they were coerced into it, like defeated soldiers on a battlefield. And I try to make the point that no, that's the gospel according to Caesar. Like that's how it went. If Caesar took over, like you declared Caesar as Lord so that you wouldn't get executed, or But when Paul uses it, he's saying no one can say Jesus Lord except through the Holy Spirit, and all will one day do this. I'm trying to say that all means all, and Jesus' lordship is over everything. And that just, I think, when it comes to like our eschatology, that has big implications. And in the interfaith thing, I just concede in the letter and say, if it doesn't mean that someone like a Rumi or a Gandhi, it doesn't mean that they're gonna, they have to convert to Christianity. I think that we're just missing the point when we're saying that.
It it reminds me of the passage in, I don't remember which gospel it is, probably the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "Some who call me Lord, Lord," what does he say? "Some who call me Lord, Lord, don't really mean it, or won't find salvation," or something like that.
I'll turn them away from me.
Yeah, and the way that you're talking is reminding me of this. So often, we talk about Jesus as Lord in a way that looks a lot more like Caesar is Lord than Jesus is Lord. And that verse used to always be a scandal for me because I want Jesus to be nice and friendly to everyone, and I assume that he is. But when we so grossly misunderstand Jesus, it's the methods that you're talking about. Caesar was Lord through the method of violence. He sent out, after he conquered people, he sent out the gospel, the evangelion, the good news, that, hey, we've conquered another city and we're going to get more taxes from them and create bigger armies and go conquer more places, because this is how empires work. Yay, isn't that good news? Whereas, the gospel writers send the good news of Jesus, which is the complete opposite, which is, hey, go spread peace through the method not of violence, but of love, even for your enemies. And so when we get caught up in the way of Caesar, which we're still trying to tease this out 2,000 years later, I just often worry that Jesus is going to say, nope, sorry, I was not your Lord. And so this is a warning. It's a warning for me just as much as it is for anyone else. But yeah.
I think, it's in that it's more pedagogy and a warning, not necessarily some like, we're supposed to then make that a systematic theology or some sort of like proof of people, enemies forever being unreconciled to God or something. Like, I think we should take that warning to heart and learn something from it.
Because even when you think that you are calling Jesus Lord, you may not be. Like, and I say you, meaning myself,
sure.
as much as anyone else.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah. Anytime that I'm, we're supposed to be unrepentant. Unrepentant. Supposed to be repentant scapegoaters, and anytime we're unrepentant, I think we're betraying Jesus' lordship. We're going against that lordship, that kingdom of God that doesn't have scapegoating and violence in it.
Yeah, and it's tricky because I'm reminded of the book of Revelation, where it talks about the Antichrist coming in as a lamb. And all that's different is that it has, I think, like horns and stuff, but it mimics the Lamb of God. It looks very, very similar, and it's easy to get them mixed up. And so it's difficult teasing these different ways out. It's so easy to get caught up in what is not Jesus than what is Jesus. So it's hard. And as you say, it's why we need one another, a community, to help us work through these things together. So
absolutely. And you're right, it is terribly hard. It's a daily struggle for sure.
Yeah. So my final question for you is that one of the themes that runs through your book is how to find meaning in life. And this goes back to Ernest Becker, right? Who says that we tell stories as meaning-making creatures. And one of the problems is that we find meaning through stories of violence. So many of the stories we tell, whether on television or news or on the big screen in theaters, center around violence. And how do we find meaning in an alternative way?
Um, well, Mike would say that there's no overarching like meaning of life. It would just be the point of the dance is the dance.
Mm.
Um, the the present now doesn't point like towards any sort of. It's not like a tool that you use to get to something else. Um, I think that one could say that the meaning of life is to experience love. Um, One could add grace. I mean, then with grace, there has to be a reason for grace, and that might get tricky. But yeah, I mean, we a lot of us have defined meaning in like who we're not, right? Like
Mm.
who our common enemies are, and I think finding meaning in the complete reverse of that, on who we allow to sit at the table, like who who of our enemies can we show love to? Who can we live in community with? I think, um, yeah, I think talking about radical inclusion, and that doesn't mean like we're completely passive towards injustices and we just allow atrocities to happen, but in living a an openly forgiving lifestyle, and who we sit at the table with, who we break bread and drink wine with, is we I think we find true meaning in that community of like radically inclusive grace, rather than who we commonly, because you know you and I could be bickering or something. As long as we can gossip about someone else, we'll find meaning, right? Unity.
Yeah. Yeah. Tom makes the comment, meaning is found in relationship. I think violence destroys relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, if God's a relational God, then that's that's where we that's where we have our identity.
Yeah. And I love Mike's point about the dance. That's the point. It's just to participate in the dance, as we would say as Christians, to participate in the dance that is God,
Yeah.
is the point. I love it. Matt,
The
thank you so
beautiful
much.
thing, the beautiful thing is the Sufi mystic would say the same thing, and
Mm,
as with the Buddhist, which I think is why these dialogues are important. Like, God's not going to be thwarted by language barriers.
that's fantastic. Thank you. Yes, thank you for having this conversation with us, and thank you for everybody for listening in and for your comments. And again, the book that's coming, that's the two books that are out right now are from the Blood of Abel, and Matt's previous book is All Set Free. Highly recommend them. And the forthcoming book is what is the official title?
It's a journey with two mystics, conversations between a Girardian and a Wattsian, and I'm guessing it'll be out in a couple weeks, from one of Wittgenstock's imprints.
Awesome. I read an early version of it and it's fantastic. So thank you for these books. And if people want to keep up with you, Matt, how can they do that?
I'm on Facebook, and I don't have the URL or anything, but my address is allsetfree.com, and I think you can just link from there. But if you just look me up on Facebook, you'll probably find me.
Fantastic. So
Yeah.
everybody, Lionel says, thank you, Matthew and Adam. It was a good conversation. Loved it. Thank you,
Thanks,
Lionel,
my
for
friend.
being here.
Thanks.
Awesome. So everybody, you can stay up to date on the RavenCast by joining the RavenCast Facebook page. You can also like the Raven Foundation Facebook page. And if you are watching on YouTube, please like this video and share it with whomever. It'll help us out a lot. If you are listening on iTunes or Stitcher, please leave a comment and a review, and that would be helpful too. And you can go on the Raven Review at ravenfoundation.org and subscribe, and that will make sure that you stay up to date on all of our articles and interviews like this one. So thanks again for being here. I hope you can join us next Thursday at noon Central Time for another live RavenCast. For more information on that, check out the Raven Foundation Facebook page or the RavenCast Facebook page. So until then, grace and peace be with you. Take care.